Howdy! Today we're going to discuss the Rolling Stones album Tattoo You. There's a lot of myth and some lore involving Tattoo You, and we're going to discuss what was behind the album, and we're going to discuss how the album came to fruition. So there's a lot of mystique about Tattoo You, and it has a draw or a lure because there is a lot of mystique and some mystery surrounding the album. For example, the title. To this day, the band claims that they had only named the album Tattoo, and that they have no idea where the U came about or how it got added on. The Y-O-U, U in the title Tattoo You. In fact, Keith Richards was upset because he had thought Mick Jagger had went ahead without his approval or okay and added on to the title. But to this day, Mick Jagger claims he has no idea how the U got there in the title. They had only named the album Tattoo. And another question was, what band members actually attended the recording sessions for Tattoo You? It was mostly Mick Jagger. Not always, but mostly Mick, just Mick Jagger. In October and November of 1980, and in April, May, and June of 1981. Another big question surrounding Tattoo You was, who is that actually on the cover? Well, it is actually Mick Jagger, but there was a lot of questions when the album came about as to who exactly was on the cover. There was even a rumor floating around it was David Bowie's just then ex-wife, who he had divorced in 1980. It is not. A lot of people thought, is it a fictional character that's meant to look kind of like Mick Jagger? It is not. It is Mick Jagger on the cover. In 1980, October, November-ish, Mick Jagger met with Chris Kimsey, who had been an engineer on their previous album, Emotional Rescue and Some Girls, and even had worked on Sticky Fingers dating all the way back to 1971, other Stones albums, met with engineer Chris Kimsey, who is also the associate producer for that album besides the Glimmer Twins. By the way, the Glimmer Twins are Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. For those of you who don't know, that's actually who the Glimmer Twins are. It's those two. Anyway, Mick Jagger met with Chris Kimsey in October to discuss a future album for the Rolling Stones, because the Rolling Stones had planned on touring the following year in 1981. They were putting together a large tour. Back then, you see, major bands usually toured every year, and a lot of the major bands put out albums to tour behind back then. Back then, the money, or a major part of the money up front for a band's revenue, was in album sales. It's not like now where the major part of the money is actually from live shows and touring, and then sales are secondary. Back then, album sales was a major, or even one could say the major part of a band's revenue. And so the Rolling Stones were planning on touring in the following year, and they didn't have an album. So Mick Jagger got together with Chris Kimsey to talk to him about it. Now, at the time, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were not exactly seeing eye to eye on the future of the Rolling Stones musically and where that should head. They weren't exactly totally at odds like would come later on between the two, but they were not exactly seeing eye to eye on the musicality of the Rolling Stones and some other things on where the band should actually head. And Chris Kimsey knew this. So Chris Kimsey suggested to Mick Jagger that from previous sessions, they seemed to have enough where they could probably put together an album. And so what Chris Kimsey and Mick Jagger did was exactly that. They got together in October and November of 1980 at Olympic Studios in London and started piecing together an album from previous sessions. You see, we didn't know this, the public, and possibly some of you out there don't know this today, but Tattoo You was an album that was comprised mostly of material from previous Stones albums. It wasn't all recorded in 1980 and 81 for the release, which would come in 1981. Almost all of it had stemmed from previous recording sessions, mostly Emotional Rescue from 1980, 1978 Some Girls. There was some from 1976's Black and Blue album, and there was even a special song called Waiting on a Friend, which actually, that song actually started in late 1972 for the Goat's Head Soup album, which was released in 1973. Most of that song, or the basis of that song, was already recorded. And so he came up with the idea to Mick Jagger that they could piece together an album from previous. They had enough, quote, in the can, end of quote, to put together an album rather than get together with Keith Richards, where Mick and him would have to push and go ahead and work through their differences of opinion on where the band should head at that point, and they might run out of time. So rather than doing that, they got together and they started piecing together an album from bits, pieces, melodies, tracks. A lot of the material wasn't finished. A lot of it didn't even have vocals. There were just melodies, and things like that they would go ahead and start to reconstruct Tattoo You in October, November 1980 in London. Now, what Chris Kimsey did is actually put together an album in two distinct parts. Part 1 and Part B. Part 1 being the rock and roll side. Part 1 of Tattoo You was a basic, stripped down, for the most part, rock and roll side. And then the second part of Tattoo You, which at the time they had cassettes, which was actually, front and back, or side A and side B of a cassette and albums, side A and side B. The second side would be comprised of mostly, matter of fact, all ballads. All right, so you had a rock and roll side and a ballad side. It made Tattoo You unique, and that's what they started piecing together. And actually, on side 1, the rock and roll side, the major single from that was Start Me Up. We all know that song. That became a huge staple in their catalog. Well, Start Me Up actually started in the Some Girls sessions as a reggae track from 1978. And then they kind of the Stones worked it into a bump rock track in 1978. And one day Keith Richards actually was listening to it being played back in 1978, and he told the engineer, Chris Kimsey, he said, you know what, wipe that, bin that. It sounds like something I heard on the radio today. And because Keith Richards didn't want the Stones to sound like a song that was already out there getting airplay. And so Chris Kimsey said, oh, okay, sure, got that, and they moved on, but he kept it. And good thing he did, because now they took the 1978 Start Me Up tracks, and then it turned into a bump rock track kind of called Never Stop as a working title, and they worked it up and it became the Cannon Monster single that we all know now. And as far as some other songs, for instance, Slave on side A, which is a great track, was actually started in the Black and Blue sessions, and most of that was already laid down from Black and Blue. the Black and Blue Sessions, which was released in 1976. Well, most of the track was recorded in 1975. But then Chris Kimsey and Mick Jagger brought in Sonny Rollins, legendary sax player, and he laid down some overdubs on sax of course, on Slave, Neighbors, and Waiting on a Friend. And he does a great job, and it sounds wonderful. Slave is an underrated Rolling Stones track, and that is on the rock and roll side, part 1, side A. And so then after recording there, they took the tracks to New York City, and the rest of it got recorded at Atlantic Studios in New York City, the Hit Factory, Electric Lady, and the Power Station. And Bob Clearmountain mixed the album at the Power Station. And speaking of Start Me Up, he actually, the reverb on the drums in Start Me Up is something famous for the Power Station, which Bob Clearmountain actually kind of developed, where he'd actually play a track in the bathroom at the Power Station. And he would get the reverb from the Power Station's bathroom. It was a woman's bathroom that he had cleaned out, and that's where you get some of that reverb sound. Well, the reverb on Charlie Watts's drums on Start Me Up actually was the reverb used at the Power Station. I'm not sure about all of it, but at least that's where that sound came from. And Bob Clearmountain used that reverb on other artists too, like Bruce Springsteen, Hungry Heart. Same reverb, that bathroom reverb from the Power Station. What he would do is he'd actually plug in the already existing, what he did for Start Me Up was he plugged in or put a speaker at the Power Station's inside the bathroom, cleaned out it was being used as a closet, a girl's bathroom at the time, cleaned that out and actually played Charlie Watts's drum track. And what he did is he kept the reverb from the bathroom of it being played in the bathroom and used that in the song. Now, they were using tape back then, so I'm sure there's no way he could just cut out the reverb from tape and splice it in, so he must have just added it as an extra track and put it at a little bit of a delay or something, but that's the reverb that you hear on Start Me Up. And he did, speaking of Bob Clearmountain, between Chris Kimsey and Bob Clearmountain, they did a fantastic job on the album, an incredible job. To actually think that all came, almost all of it, when I say all of it, I mean like 90% came from previous sessions throughout the years. And they did a fantastic job of making Tattoo You all sound like it was from the same cloth. But it was anything but from the same cloth. So Bob Clearmountain mixed the album, and then it was released on August 24th, 1981. You had your side A and side B, Act 1 and Act 2. And Tattoo You became a massive success. It was a huge hit. The Rolling Stones went on tour in 1981, and it was a huge tour, and they toured behind that album. And MTV was new in 1981, and the Stones were in good rotation on MTV, which also helped the album. Start Me Up, the famous video. Waiting on a Friend, another famous video. Neighbors, Worried About You, but that didn't get hardly any airplay, but it was still a video. And Hang Fire. But Start Me Up and Waiting on a Friend were the two major hit videos that were always in rotation. The Stones went on tour that year and kind of reinvented themselves. With Mick Jagger, he wore the football pants in 1981 on stage, and they kind of had a new look. The tour was huge, massively successful. The album was one of those albums back then. There were certain albums that you just had to have. Whether you were a fan of the group or not. There were certain albums that everybody just had to have. One might have been from those days was Breakfast in America by Supertramp. That was in the late 70s, but everybody had it. Another one from that same year, 1981, was REO Speedwagon's High Infidelity. You just had to have it. Even if you weren't a huge fan of the band, you just had these albums. One from the later 80s was Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses. Everybody had it. Well, Tattoo You was kind of one of those albums. Even if you weren't a total Stones fan always, you had Tattoo You. It was a heavyweight album. And the album is divided in two parts. Part 1 and Part 2. And Part 1 is a basic, stripped down, I'd say narrower sound, a straightforward sound, and a basic rock and roll album. And it's decent. It's decent. You have the Cannon Monster single and the Wonderful Slave. But it is side 2, the second act. Side B, which really makes Tattoo You turn from just a decent album, a good/good album, into a great one. It is an expansive side. There's a string of soul-based bluesy ballads on side B. And Mick Jagger sings and pours his heart out, and he comes from a vulnerable spot in which it wasn't really heard before on a Stones record. And it is a larger sound on B, a weighty sound, an expansive sound, but it still fit Tattoo You, because Tattoo You was like a coin. You have one side of a coin and another. They're different, but it works together nicely. That's what Tattoo You is. And on side B of Tattoo You, this string of ballads, when I first heard it as a kid, I got Tattoo You, I didn't get it. I thought, this doesn't sound like the Rolling Stones that I've always known. It doesn't sound like anything I've heard before. Mick Jagger sings a lot of falsetto on side B, and I didn't get it. I didn't get it. I knew it sounded good. I knew it was well done, but it wasn't the Stones that I was used to. Well, side B later would become the winner of the album for me in so many, because it is side B which really makes it something special. And when I was 18, I listened and I got more and more used to side B, the second side of Tattoo You, and then I got it. It is a wonderful, wonderful side. It has a soul-based, bluesy side, but side B, the string of ballads, takes getting used to. You have to get used to the songs, and then you start to love it. And I fell in love with the album after that based on side B. And the Rolling Stones went on to tour, as I said, had a fantastic year, and that chapter in their career is now one of the high points, because it really made the Stones on the front page news again, and it was another high point for the band. And now Tattoo You's a classic. The album's cover art is classic. Peter Corriston oversaw the direction of Tattoo You's cover art, and Hubert Kretschmar also worked on the cover art for Tattoo You. He took the photo of Mick Jagger on Tattoo You, because that's actually Mick. That's another part of the lure of Tattoo You. That's actually Mick Jagger on the front. He actually took the photo of Mick Jagger, and Christian Piper did the illustration on that. And between Hubert Kretschmar, Peter Corriston, and Christian Piper, they made a classic album cover. Everybody knew that album cover back then, and it's one of those albums that always sticks in your mind, not only from the uniqueness of it, from the difference of side A and side B, but the cover art and the year in Stones history. So now it's a classic, and when you pick up Tattoo You, you'll have to get used to the second side. It's not something that instantly maybe would grab you, but once you get used to it, you'll get it. A wise man once said, if you're ever going through a difficult time in a relationship and you're just getting over it, or you just went through a bad breakup, put on side B of Tattoo You. It'll never let you down.